So I'm going to kick the presentation off, and then Jacob will pick up about halfway through. But that QR code will take you to the map if you want to kind of follow along as we talk about it. So this project kind of got its start as part of Matt Wilson's community mapping class at the University of Kentucky, where we were working with the city of Louisville to kind of map potential demographic impacts of a redevelopment project along the Preston Avenue corridor, which you can see with the dotted yellow line. And one of the things that we were looking at in relation to what might affect neighborhood change in Louisville was the incidence of foreclosure around these particular areas. And so as part of that, we developed this data set of foreclosures in Louisville from the Jefferson County Circuit Court and begun to build out the map that you can see here. So we're both mapping like parcel level incidences of foreclosures and then also have kind of a summative table embedded in the tool. So in recent years, a range of open source data tools have been used to make urban data about property ownership more accessible. Certainly, we're not the only people who have made these types of tools or are thinking about these types of things, but largely they're responding to the question of who owns what in cities. And I think that's kind of an increasing question that's coming up in cities across the US, right? And one way that that might be happening is in response to the increasing centralization of housing ownership, which is kind of one of the ways that we're framing the work that we're doing with the foreclosure map. So specifically, foreclosure data is useful for a variety of things. One of them is that it maps property ownership for individual parcels. And it also kind of shows investment dynamics across an urban area. So we think of foreclosure data not necessarily as the thing that we're trying to map here, but as something that's kind of allows us to build a tool that's illustrative of larger processes that are happening in cities around ownership, concentration, and investment. And so we also intend for it to be a sort of replicable tool for mapping parcel level ownership with other types of data sets, particularly things like county assessment data sets that have ownership for properties across the entirety of a city. And so kind of citing some of those projects that we've drawn inspiration from, they're all kind of doing different things, and we wanted to highlight a couple of the other projects that are working in other geographies or doing different types of analysis than we're doing in our tool. But the San Francisco Bay Chronicle has mapped property level ownership in the San Francisco Bay. It has a sort of search function embedded in it to look up your particular property and then also identify others owned by the same investor or property owner. And there are sort of like issues that come with that, namely that like legal structures like LLCs limit your ability to understand property ownership across the entirety of a portfolio. But it is really useful just as like an individual tool to look up your specific property. They did go on to kind of do more analysis across the Bay Area as a whole, but the tool itself is really individual parcel level lookup. And it is highly replicable if you're granted access to the assessment data set, which county assessors usually are kind of arbiters of this types of data. So another one that kind of comes across or helps overcome that problem of linking across different legal entities is Tenant Power by Eric Huntley, who's also a UK alum. And what Eric was doing is mapping ownership for multifamily buildings in the Boston, Massachusetts area. And one of the ways that they were thinking about how do I overcome this issue with the legal entity is using a sort of like supervised machine learning algorithm to identify instances where you might have shared ownership. So it could be something like SFR company AB1, SFR company AB2. And so you use that to kind of identify instances where you had close matches, but not exact matches. And then how replicable is it? It's open source, so it is replicable, but you kind of have to have the technical skills to be able to reproduce that. And then finally, another way of thinking about the ways that property ownership and development are happening in cities is through the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which has a suite of different maps they've made, and I'm kind of pulling one instance here, which is a story map of Los Angeles policing, and they use public records to kind of dive into the ways that particular policing regimes function to kind of incentivize redevelopment in Los Angeles, or kind of clear space for redevelopment to happen. And that's like obviously really specific to the context of LA and the capacity to access those court records and look at the ways that particular policing strategies cleared space or affected property ownership in some way. And so, like I said earlier, we approach foreclosure sales like what it is that we're actually looking at in this map, not necessarily as something that is novel information or like a novel analysis that we're producing, but as a useful template. Largely because prior work has documented the central role of foreclosure auctions in accumulating housing portfolios, thinking specifically of like Dan Immergluck's work in Atlanta. And also because we already know like who foreclosures impacted the most, namely African-American neighborhoods as sites of this foreclosure accumulation process. And kind of the three things that are embedded in foreclosure data that we think make it useful to kind of building out and applying elsewhere are the sort of parcel level identification of ownership, and then the identification of the investor attached to the parcel, and then finally, building in a capacity to display the value of the property or the purchaser price. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob to talk more about our data.
Yeah, so hi everybody. I'll be talking about kind of what we actually did, how we built the tool, what data we worked with, how we went through and did that. So our source data, as Michael said, is from the Jefferson County Circuit Courts. Jefferson County is where Louisville is located. It's a combined city-county government. So effectively, it's looking at everything, every foreclosure that occurred in that county, which is effectively also the city. And since Kentucky is a judicial foreclosure state, that means that pretty much every foreclosure does go through that judicial foreclosure process and thus produces court records. So we took those court records for Jefferson County and used that as the basis for our tool. You can see kind of in our top left here, it's, I know, illegible, but that's the hosting webpage they have for these court records, which they have as Excel documents. Going back to 2011. We focused just on the 2016 to 2022 window, just kind of for looking at the most recent data, and also there were some slight differences in the data formatting, so it's just simpler to kind of focus on that range. So across 2016 to 2022, there are almost 9,200 cases of judicial foreclosures in these records. We were able to we did map 5,700 approximately of them. The 3,400 difference, those are all quick cases which were withdrawn. So that means that the foreclosure proceedings began but didn't actually produce a sale or a default. Sale being, as we're using it, purchased by another entity, default meaning purchased by the foreclosing entity itself. And of those 5,400 or 5,700, 52 were unique, meaning that there's about 150 that went through foreclosure proceedings multiple times during this period. About 150 of those, yeah. And so again, won't be able to read this, but the Excel spreadsheet down below here has kind of all of the data that's included with that. Importantly, for our purposes, mapping, obviously we need some spatial data, so we have an address as well as the date of sale, the plaintiff, which is the foreclosing entity, the defendant, who's being foreclosed upon, the purchaser, who actually bought that foreclosed property, as well as the value of the winning bid and other assorted filing data. Importantly, we did not include the defendant data in our map. It's not really the focus that we're looking at here, and not really important to our analysis to include who exactly was foreclosed on. So to actually prepare the data, it was really just a geocoding process. But as anyone who's worked with municipal data, specifically related to municipal data that isn't meant to be mapped, will know it's often a bit messy. So we had to spend some time separating, cleaning it up, making sure that we have fields that could be run through a geocoder. We used the Tidy geocoder package through R to run it through the Nominatum system, OpenStreetMaps. And we were able to get all but about 340 of them geocoded through that process. The rest we did by hand through just checking through OpenStreetMaps and Google Maps. Most of those were based on spelling or naming irregularities. So there's a street in Louisville, Dr. W.J. Hodge Street. As you might imagine, that one gave us a lot of trouble. There's a lot of differences in where the spaces are, where the periods are, so we had to clean all that out. During this, we also did some work to clean up the purchaser data. So for example, we have Joseph, no middle name, Burnett. And so that also appeared as like Joe W. Burnett or Joseph Burnett, and so we had to find those matches and clean them up. And we did that for the top purchasers, so we did kind of an initial aggregation to find those and then went through. So there are still some that'll appear to have some irregularities throughout the map. There are also some incomplete addresses and some which were sold as part of a whole. So that means that like maybe 3 to 5 adjoining properties were all sold as one foreclosure sale, and so we treated that as one unit at one point on the map. And the one we were unable to do is basically just parcel information. So we weren't able to pull any address data from it. We could probably fix that if we spent another minute doing that. And then we were able to run it through Leaflet to map it. Just export it as a GeoJSON, brought into Leaflet, visualized it as points. We jiggled the points specifically for those which were the same address, so we have a little bit of difference there, so you can actually click on each different instance, and then generated a pop-up that shows the information. This is just a really early design. This was based on if you could recognize the Bay Area over there, the San Francisco Bay Chronicle map. We were kind of working off of their design to kind of think about how we would like to do our own. There's some overlays here that we ultimately moved away from. So these screenshots here are how it appears on a mobile device, which is really how we intended it to be viewed. As you can see, these are, you can kind of tell, landscape orientations, which was our initial cut, but we decided to really focus on mobile uses because we want it to be able to be pulled up and referenced by people easily on whatever device they're on. So we really built this, again, with Leaflet, JavaScript, pulling in some Bootstrap library. And the general design that we tried to go for is this left hand is kind of what's above the fold, the top of the screen, and then the left hand is our kind of functional tools that are associated with the map. And so I'll actually just jump over to the map quickly, if we can do this. View full screen. So this is what it looks like on browser, pretty much the same, but we have a few different kind of functions that we felt were really important. The first is to kind of have just some contextual data here, basically what Michael ran through in a condensed format. We also have a tool here, a year drop-down to change, so you can look at any of the different years associated with it, as well as every year in our data set. You can click on any of these and it'll populate with date of sale, sale price, foreclosure, purchaser, or a defaulting entity. Now, my favorite part of this is we built out a linked table here, and what this does is actually aggregate all of those highest volume purchasers from the foreclosure auctions, and if we click on it, it'll then show their purchases on the map, here highlighted in yellow. And so we can go through this and kind of see the spatial patterns of these different major purchases across these years, go in and click and highlight, and see kind of where and what they were doing. We also built out a search tool, so if you're more familiar with Louisville, if you want to look at a particular address or neighborhood, you can type that in here, select your address, and it'll pull it up and show kind of that particular address and their foreclosure details. Okay. Yeah, and again, we really wanted this to be mobile first, so the browser experience is hopefully good, but ultimately we were hoping that the mobile experience is even better. So yeah, to treat this like our other examples, we're really trying to show the spatial patterns of A, foreclosure, and B, real estate investment via foreclosure auctions in Louisville. Now, it doesn't show all of real estate investment in Louisville, obviously, hopefully. Like Michael indicated, capturing multi-entity ownership, right? So if you have different LLCs that are buying, but they're all affiliated with one group or entity, but they're different names, that's hard to capture, and this map doesn't do that. It also doesn't capture any dynamics of real estate investment that happen outside of these foreclosures, right? So maybe that these foreclosures are a default, but that defaulting entity then goes ahead and sells that to real estate investors. This is also not captured in our map. So this is only one kind of corner and one avenue of real estate investment, and in Louisville specifically right now. In terms of replicability, hypothetically, you could do this in any state and any county that predominantly relies on judicial foreclosures, right? They all produce court records. Not all of them produce the same kind of ease of use court records as like an Excel spreadsheet is. For example, even in Fayette County, where Lexington is, we looked there and they only have foreclosure records for, I think it was like the past year, past 6 months. And it's not in kind of an easily accessible format like that, so you need to do some kind of web scraping to get that into a format to use. Right, and in many states, we have some listed very small down here. These are maybe what are considered predominantly judicial foreclosure states. Even in those states, not all foreclosures go through that process. Many of them are non-judicial, even in states that predominantly are judicial. But ultimately, as Michael said, the tool, what we hope to do with the tool is that it can be adapted to really any property assessment data set. Anything that has to do with urban properties, ownership dynamics, and property values could be kind of displayed and run through a similar template. So yeah, in conclusion, urban data tools are useful. Foreclosure data is also useful. And finally, templates are also useful. So we're hoping that kind of you come away with this with a kind of maybe a little bit more of an understanding or appreciation for each of these things. And yeah, we have our QR code here. Sorry, we went through that quickly. If you want to look at the map and play around with it on your phone. Any feedback, also very welcome. Thank you.
We have a little time for questions if anybody has any.
Did you use any JavaScript frameworks at all?
I don't think we used any particular frameworks, did we? No, it was mostly just JavaScript and Bootstrap library, yeah. Yeah.
Yes, is there a particular version of Bootstrap that you found that would work well for mobile and desktop, or how did you design a site, what techniques did you use to make it work on mobile and desktop?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
What techniques or what tools did you use to make it work well on mobile and desktop?
Well, with the mobile first, we mostly just used kind of the trial and error and developer view in the browser to kind of make sure that. And then as we were kind of going through that process, it was, again, with the browser, it was like making a change for the mobile, making sure that it worked well there, and then going back to the browser and being like, well, that broke something, so now we need to find an in-between to do that. So I can't say that we have a set of best practices for design, trial and error.
I have a question. Has there been any community reception to your project? Are you kind of still launching it, or are you excited to do further analysis on your own time to kind of use this tool?
Yeah, so I think we would like to use the tool, not necessarily with the specific instance of foreclosures, but to kind of get community involvement on however we adapt it at the next step. So one thing that I'm thinking about in dissertation research is doing something similar around mapping all of property ownership in Memphis, Tennessee. Not just necessarily foreclosures, but the sort of entirety of property ownership in the city. And for that, I think it would be really important actually to get community involvement on how you're displaying ownership or to what end you're using the data for.
Cool. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Great. Okay, thank you.